there are any latecomers, I'll add them in as and when.
Yeah, of course. Okay, good afternoon everyone. My name's Connie and I'm a barrister specialising in family law. I practice exclusively in care, private children and domestic abuse proceedings. My co-host this afternoon is Pip. She's a pupil barrister, also at Spire, specialising in family law, practising in the same areas as me, and additionally court of protection work. I'm not sure how many people who are on this webinar attended our webinar last week, but basically we hosted a similar setup, but looking at whether social workers should undertake statutory visits during the coronavirus pandemic. Today we're going to look specifically at parenting assessment sessions. A lot of what we said last week continues to apply to parenting assessment sessions. So if you didn't attend the webinar last week and you'd like to catch up on that, it is available on our Chambers YouTube channel. And I'm sure that we will be able to circulate a link to that if you don't already have one. Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, please. So looking at the agenda for this afternoon, first of all, Pip's going to take you through the government guidance which currently applies to undertaking parenting assessments, although this does seem to constantly be changing, so it does need to be kept under review. I will then go through an example of a recent case in which the issue of remote assessment sessions was considered. Pip will then look at the impact on assessments if sessions are taken remotely. And finally, I will discuss a possible solution so that parenting assessments can still be undertaken whilst maintaining high levels of safety for all involved. So I will now pass you over to Pip to look at the guidance provided by the government.
Thank you. So yeah, beginning with what information has been provided to us so far. The first thing that I want to look at that will be of use is the timescales for assessments. So really the first set of guidance provides for situations where a child is to remain with or to return to the care of the parent before the parenting assessment has been completed. So this is section 19 of the Care Planning, Placement and Case Review Regulations. And an amendment has been made to that, as you can see on the screen, by the Adoption and Children Coronavirus Amendments Regulations, section 8. And that allows the time for filing those assessments to be extended. Instead of 10 working days, the assessment can be filed as soon as is reasonably practicable after placement. The placement, obviously, as you will be aware, prior to the assessment, will have its own risks, and they are things that will be considered before a decision to place is made. But the assessment itself should still be finalised as soon as possible to ensure that the duties to the child or the children that the local authority have are upheld. Those duties do not change. They're set out in more detail in our seminar last week, but the welfare duties of the local authority essentially is what I'm referring to, and they're unchanged by the guidance, but the time limits for filing the assessment when placed are amended. The flexibility that's been given by that amendment is only to be used when it is considered necessary. And in a lot of cases that I've come across so far, the justification is being asked for when the extended timescale is to be used or being requested. So that's something to bear in mind if you think you'll be in a position where you'll need to use the timescale flexibility. The guidance further tells us in relation to all work, but where it might particularly be applicable to assessments that we're looking at today, the most complex or high risk cases are to be prioritised. So in situations where you don't have enough resources or staff to complete the number of assessments within the timescales that you have in your workload, the assessments which should take priority are those for which delay would have the greatest impact. So these are cases where you might have a care plan with a plan for adoption. And so as the child gets older, their likelihood of being adopted decreases. And in this case, a delay to the parenting assessment would have a really great impact on the welfare of the child. And that's a case that you might consider a priority case that should really come first when you don't have the resources to complete all parenting assessments without some having to experience delay. It might also be appropriate to prioritise cases where the child remains in the home and there are serious concerns about the care being given, and the assessment, the parenting assessment, is what's required to demonstrate the seriousness of those risks to the court. And so you may consider that that parenting assessment needs to take place as a matter of urgency and should not experience delay. Then going on to considering if you are in a situation where some cases need to be prioritised and some parenting assessments need to take precedence over others, the guidance provides that any flexibility which is now used is only to be used when deemed absolutely necessary. So I referred to this just a moment ago, but really that phrase absolutely necessary needs to be borne in mind when you're considering any flexibility or any prioritisation of cases. The decisions which result in delaying the parenting assessment need to be undertaken carefully. Excuse me if I pause a moment while I admit people into the Zoom. So any decisions to prioritise or to amend timescales for parenting assessments are to be subject to that provision that it must be absolutely necessary. The guidance does show some understanding of the difficult position that social workers and local authorities are in, and there is a recognition that the work being done is being done in a very strange time, in a different way, and that the pressures are much greater than usual. So that is something that has been recognised, and you should feel some encouragement that the government does understand how difficult things are at the moment. But there are principles that still need to be followed to ensure the welfare of the children in these cases. There are notes in the guidance that recognise the previous timescales and the previous way of working simply isn't possible at the moment, and so continuing as normal for a lot of situations and assessment won't be possible. But this must really come under the proviso of when is it absolutely necessary to make changes. When you're making these decisions about which cases should take priority, and it's become clear to you that assessments cannot take place within the timescale previously set, the next step is to consult with your senior management. This should happen as soon as it becomes evident to you that the current timescales can't be complied with. And it's hoped that through consultation with your team manager and management higher up than that, a consensus can be reached as to what is achievable, and resources can be pulled either from other teams in the same local authority or from external bodies in order to reduce the delays as much as possible. And that's something that by speaking to your senior management, you might become aware of where there are resources that you can draw upon to try and reduce the delay. So that's really a step that is really important and should be considered at the soonest possible instance. So in that consultation, and when you're taking a view as to which assessments need to be completed first and which assessments might not be overtly negatively impacted by a small delay, the long-standing principles which you will have been working with throughout your careers as social workers still remain and are, we're guided, are to be used in these circumstances and for these decisions as well. So those principles are firstly to be child-centred. The primary consideration, as it will be with all of your work, is the impact on the child's welfare in a delay to a parenting assessment. Secondly, prioritising those who are most at risk. So this will be looking at the family unit as a whole and considering how risks can be managed or reduced if a delay is required in finalising the assessment. Thirdly, to be evidence informed, so using the information that's been gathered on the families to assist you in making those difficult decisions. Next, we're guided to be collaborative. So we're encouraged to work alongside the other teams in the local authority, and as I mentioned, outside bodies in order to reduce delays. And finally, to be transparent. So it's essential that once a decision has been made internally about any delay, the results of that are communicated to all of those involved in the case. So alternative arrangements can be made and things can be put in place to ensure that the child or the children are safeguarded in the meantime. And those principles are ones which I'm sure you will be familiar of, but they are what we're being asked to now apply to considerations about delaying parenting assessments. So considering the assessment itself, the guidance hasn't prescribed a method of conducting parenting assessments during lockdown. The government have entrusted every local authority to make their own decisions, consider their own resources, and the families within their area to devise a way in which their respective assessments can be conducted properly and safely. Some assessments might be suitable for remote sessions, particularly over video call is being suggested as appropriate there. Some could be a hybrid of remote and in-person sessions, and it's really for each local authority and each social work team to consider and decide what format is best to ensure the assessments are full and ensure that conclusions made within the assessments are properly evidenced. When you're considering continuing with an assessment in person during the period of lockdown and having assessment sessions in person, there needs to be a balancing of the risks posed, and the guidance is quite clear that the risks involved that we must consider are threefold, and that's the exercise that you need to carry out in order to make a decision as to in-person or remote sessions. So firstly, the consideration is the risks to the children. This in turn is two-sided. So what are the risks of conducting a visit to the home? These risks being COVID-19 related and not. So you need to really take as wide a view as possible of those risks. And the other side of that coin, so to speak, is what are the risks of not conducting a visit to the children, and so not having sight of the parents' care for the child or children when they are placed at home. The second consideration is what are the risks to the parents and the wider family of attending at the home, and what are the risks if an in-person visit does not take place at the home to the wider family. Finally, we're asked to consider the risks to the workforce. So these are the health risks to each individual social worker who conducts a visit, if they are conducting an in-person visit. But then the consideration follows onto the risks to other social workers or team members who they come into contact with after the assessment, and how that is spread potentially to the wider workforce after an in-person visit. If once these factors are considered, an in-person visit is to go ahead and it's decided appropriate, a risk assessment needs to take place. The suggestion is by telephone, but really that can be by telephone or video call, whatever you think is appropriate and easiest to arrange. So that visit is, that assessment, is to ascertain whether anybody in the family or in the household has or has recently had symptoms of COVID-19. Following from that, there's guidance as to what you should do depending how the risk assessment is finished. So if nobody has symptoms or has had symptoms recently, we're told the visit can be conducted safely as long as social distancing and hand washing guidance remains in place. If the household or a member of the household has had symptoms recently or currently of COVID-19, we're told that an assessment visit can take place safely so long as it is socially distant. So when you're entering the home and a 2-metre distance is difficult to maintain in that circumstance, PPE should be taken. I think as many of you will probably agree, if you're in a house with several members of the family and there are, for example, small corridors, small rooms, it will be really difficult to keep that 2-metre distance. So in those situations, PPE will almost certainly be required. And if following the risk assessment you're unsure if anyone's showing symptoms, then you should attend, knock on the door, move 2 metres back, and then have a conversation with those within the household to ascertain whether anyone has symptoms or not. And in those circumstances, PPE should be taken with you in the event that somebody does have symptoms and you are going to enter the home. A bit more information on the PPE there. What's being recommended for social work visits is the 3rd row down on the left, individual's own home. That's the category applicable to social work home visits. And this recommends disposable gloves, a disposable plastic apron, and a surgical mask, all of those to be single use. There is some ambiguity with the guidance that we've been given, in that the government does not tell us that PPE is necessary, but that it should be taken or it might not need to be taken, and these things. But I think really you need to take a common sense judgment as to if somebody in the house has symptoms and you are likely to be touching surfaces that they've been touching, or you're likely to be in a room that isn't very well aerated, those kind of things, then PPE will almost certainly be needed to protect you and to protect members of the household as well. Moving on to once your visits have been completed, then whether they are remote or in person, once all of the information that you require has been gathered, we've got some guidance as well which touches on how the information is to be compiled into an assessment and a final report is to be produced. So some guidance that's been given in terms of panels, where you are required to hold a panel to discuss the information and the outcome of the assessments. These should take place virtually, and it's been recommended that a video call platform is to be used. Given the nature of what will be discussed during that conversation and that panel meeting, secure platforms are recommended. I'm sure each local authority will have its own guidance as to which platforms are deemed appropriate and which platforms that you are using each as your best practice. But things that need to be considered, for example, when using the Zoom platform like we are today, is that you must then lock the room once everybody is in attendance, and that stops people inadvertently joining the meeting and being party to confidential information. Where in-person visits have not been possible, or you've had fewer than usual, it's recommended within the guidance that the team preparing the assessment liaise with any professionals who've had sight of the family recently. This must be done with the confidentiality restrictions on assessments being borne in mind, but it might be things like speaking with the school if the children are attending, seeing if anybody has witnessed the drop-offs or the pickups and the presentation of the parents during those, or things like medical appointments where the information can be shared within the confidentiality restrictions and the information is relevant to the assessment that you're conducting. Given the limits that there are on obtaining information during a remote visit, it might also be necessary to explore further the external information which has been provided to give an overall picture of the parenting capabilities and what's happening within each family. It might also assist if you have a detailed note to refer to of each virtual visit and each remote session, so how the presentation of the parents and the children has changed across sessions, monitoring what you see in each session, how that might be different between sessions. And so you really have a point of reference when compiling the report to see how things have progressed and whether then there's been any positive or negative changes between the sessions. Then move on to Connie now to look at a working example of how this issue is being approached in the family courts.
Last week, we were able to discuss a little bit more about how statutory visits had been approached by the family court. The issue today, we're looking at how the courts are looking at how remote parenting assessments should be taken, or if they should be taken at all. is that we're not currently at a stage within lockdown where a lot of parenting assessments should have been undertaken and filed. So we're looking at it from a point of view of very early stages within the parenting assessments. I do know of one example of a case that has recently been in court, which was looking at remote assessments versus face-to-face assessments. So Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, please. So basically what had happened in this case, it's not a case that I'm involved in myself, but I am aware of the circumstances of it. There was a negative parenting assessment undertaken by a social worker. This was done pre-lockdown, so there were no issues as to whether this assessment could be done face-to-face or remotely. As I've said, that was a negative assessment of the parent, and therefore the mother, who had been negatively assessed, made an application for assessment by an independent social worker. The relevance of this case to this webinar is that further assessment by the social worker would have been taken at least partially face-to-face, whereas if the court proceeded with an assessment by an independent social worker, this would have been undertaken entirely remotely. I must stress that this issue was considered before the lockdown restrictions were relaxed. That will need to be taken into consideration, and I will deal with that later on. So in that case, the court looked at the case of repeat, which has been widely referenced because it was the president of the family division that was involved in that case, and it considered the appropriateness of a remote finding of fact hearing regarding allegations made by the local authority against the mother in that case of fabricated or induced illness. Just as an aside to that, if you're not familiar with this case and you'd like to know a little bit more about it without reading the full judgment, which has been published, I have written an article about it, and this has been published on our Chambers website. If anyone needs me to forward the link to that, I'm happy to do so, but it should be easy to find on the website. Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, please. Okay, so looking at the submissions that were made on behalf of the local authority who opposed the application for an independent social worker assessment, and also in respect of the mother. So arguing against the remote independent social worker assessment, counsel for the local authority submitted that firstly, the principles in REP were equally applicable to parenting assessments being conducted, and whether this was by a social worker or an independent social worker. And they said it's a crucial element in the social worker's analysis for the social worker to be able to experience the behaviour of the parent, who is the focus of the assessment throughout the assessment process, not only when they're being questioned, but equally when they are sitting and reacting, as they may or may not do, to the factual matters and the information as it is given and discussed within the assessment. And the more important part is for the social worker to see the person whilst they are being assessed. And although this is possible over Skype, to keep a postage stamp image live on the screen, it is a very poor substitute to seeing that person fully present during the assessment. Council also submitted that sessions by remote means did not allow for a full and proper observation of the child in the mother's care during the assessment session. And there was almost no way of being able to assess attachment in that scenario. Also, there was no way of being able to assess responsiveness and the relationship as an overall between the mother and the child. And finally, counsel for the local authority said that if a remote assessment had been suggested in a time where lockdown and social distancing was not an issue, nobody would have considered that a remote assessment, at least a full remote assessment, was fair. Counsel for the mother argued that the local authority undertaking an assessment, although it would have been face-to-face, and the social worker, the current social worker, was open to undertaking a further assessment, would likely end up in lack of fairness to the mother. But counsel for the local authority responded saying, well, proceedings involve ensuring fairness to all parties, including the local authority, and it would be unfair to expect a local authority to accept and adopt a care plan on the back of an assessment by somebody who would never meet the mother. In that case, surprisingly, at least to me, the judge did grant leave for the independent social worker to undertake the assessment. The local authority initially sought leave to appeal on the basis that the judge was wrong, although fortunately shortly after the hearing, the matter was resolved when an independent social worker who would do the assessment face to face was found. It perhaps would have been more helpful if the matter had been appealed, and we would have had some precedent on whether an independent social worker undertaking an assessment entirely remotely would be something that the courts higher up would be happy with. Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, please. So my view personally is that we shouldn't compromise what is fair, which is face-to-face assessments, simply for the sake of getting the assessment completed. However, it is of course important to note that there is a balance to be struck. Despite the guidance being that the assessment should be completed as soon as reasonably practicable, in the last 12-13 weeks, I have not come across a judge yet that is happy with there being no end date for a parenting assessment to be filed, because there's still uncertainty about when and how further relaxations of the lockdown restrictions will take place. We must remember the delay principle, which is set out in section 1, subsection 2 of the Children Act 1989, namely that any delay in resolving children proceedings is likely to prejudice the welfare of the child, which will always be the court's paramount consideration. So I'll now hand you back to Pip to look at the impact of remote parenting assessment sessions.
So I'll just move on now to consider how the assessments themselves might be affected by remote or hybrid assessment sessions taking place. So to start with, I want to consider the things that we should keep in mind when conducting the remote sessions, and then ultimately coming to a final conclusion in the report provided. The nature of speaking to a family and a parent via video call is unfamiliar to many, and it can feel quite awkward and uncomfortable, as I'm sure you've all experienced. Even just speaking socially to people over Zoom, it is not the same as in person, and it can feel quite disjointed. This is really something that needs to be taken into account where possible when you're considering the presentation of parents. It won't be an equal substitute for having what might be considered a more familiar or a more comfortable in-person conversation, and it may impact on how they present to you, or at least how you can perceive their presentation and the limits to that. In a remote session, it will be incredibly difficult, as Connie has mentioned, to gain the same level of insight into the home environment as you would get in an in-person visit. There isn't much really that can be done to remedy that when we're limited to using video conferencing platforms, but it might require you to ask more questions, to ask to see certain areas of the home, and that could assist in giving you a bit better of an insight that you might have been able to achieve with an in-person visit. Another factor that needs to be considered really is that a lot of people are struggling right now. It seems very blasé to say it, or very an obvious point, but it's something that should be factored in when you're considering the assessment of somebody. The restrictions on movement have given us all challenges, and it's likely that the parents who you're assessing have also had more stress to deal with, or undue pressures at this time. I think we need to remember that the parents who are being assessed, just as none of us have, will have been given time, to prepare for the way that we're living at the moment, and it will have impacted them, and that will reflect most likely in their behaviour, in their presentation, in the stress that they're showing. And these are all things that should be considered when you're looking at how the parents are coping, just as we consider how the rest of us are coping. For parents who are struggling as a result of the lockdown and the movement restrictions, it might be necessary to allow extra time to conduct the assessment sessions when they're being done by video platform. So you can speak to the parents about the difficulties they're facing and the measures that they're taking to cope. It might also be a time where you find it appropriate to offer online resources to assist the parents in coping with the difficulties that have arisen specifically for each individual household. Having said that, while some parents will benefit from longer sessions and time to consider the difficulties that they're facing, it might be that some parents struggle to engage for long periods of time over video platforms. And in particular, you might find this with younger parents or parents with mental health difficulties. Really sitting and having that assessment session over a screen for a long period of time might be difficult for them. And in those cases, you might find it beneficial to schedule shorter assessment sessions and have a greater number of them. Finally, something I'm sure you will all be incredibly aware of, but a point that I think needs to be borne in mind, is that some of the parents you're assessing might be in abusive relationships and in difficult households, either from their own parents or their partners. And so when you're conducting these assessment sessions, if this is the only or the primary form of contact that you're having with these parents, you might wish to consider the use of things like the chat facility on Zoom in order to communicate with the parents and allow them to communicate openly with you without anyone else in the household being able to hear, or without being concerned of people listening to those conversations. That is something that we considered in greater detail when you're looking at visits to the home for welfare visits, but where your main interaction is through an assessment visit, it's something that can be considered and might be helpful and point you in the right direction of the next steps to take with that family. Considering then a final point, and that's the risks that arise from having these remote parenting assessment sessions. As I've considered on the previous slide, there will be some parents for whom you're only able to gain a superficial insight into their capabilities through a remote session. And it'll be difficult sometimes to appreciate the full range of a parent's skills or their difficulties over a video call. It'll be even more difficult in these circumstances when the children are not in the home. And in those circumstances, you might not be able to continue at all with the assessment. And you should feel very secure in the fact that if you cannot conduct the assessment properly because of the restrictions, then the guidance, as we've mentioned, will allow for delay to that. And you shouldn't feel any concern with saying, I really can't conduct this properly if all I can use is a video platform, because allowances will be made for that and will be required. The insight in remote sessions will be different, and it won't be of the same quality as an in-person session generally, which is something that really needs to be at the forefront of your mind when conducting each of the sessions. And as such, coming to conclusions about parenting capabilities will be incredibly difficult when the information that you've been able to obtain remotely or with fewer sessions is less than it would be in the sort of normal times, usual parenting assessments. The conclusions of these parenting assessments, whether they are conducted remotely, in person, over a longer period or a shorter period, they have profound impacts on parents, on their children, and on the wider family. And if in any instance you feel that you've been unable to see the full picture through a remote assessment, and by not seeing the full picture, you cannot safely and properly justly make a conclusion about the parent's abilities, you should carefully consider at this point whether it's possible to produce a final report at all. I think we need to be careful that the pressures and the time constraints at the moment don't add undue stress and push people to attempting to make conclusions and finalise reports when the evidence provided is insufficient and these reports can't safely be concluded. when the situation arises that I've just explained, consider the flexibility provisions, consider asking for extra time, looking at external bodies to help you conclude your report. And it might also be helpful that any delay that you see now in being able to conduct these sessions and finalise the reports might be lesser when we move with the expected lifting of restrictions next month to further relax what we're able to do and reduce the risks that we're having to consider. So hopefully any delays that are considered at the moment will shortly be alleviated as we move out of the phase of restriction that we're seeing at the moment.
So what can be done to alleviate the difficulties posed by assessment sessions? In a case that I am involved with, a parenting assessment plan has been filed and approved by the judge in that case, which proposes that the parenting assessment is undertaken, as Pip has mentioned before, on a hybrid basis. Yeah, Pip, if you could just change the slide for me, thank you. So the first half of the assessment, which will look at the parents' family functioning, childhood and relationships, and the parents' understanding of the impact, the general impact of issues such as mental health problems, domestic abuse and drug misuse can have on children, will all be done remotely. And the second half of the assessment, which will look at the parents' abilities to keep their children safe, so looking more specifically at their family unit, their understanding of the local authorities' concerns, their understanding of what needs to change to manage those concerns, and what support they feel they need will be done face to face. Like I said, the judge was content with this parenting assessment plan and approved it at the hearing. Extra time was requested on behalf of the local authority to undertake this assessment. And the similar applied to perhaps connected persons assessments and special guardianship assessments, but the judge refused to extend the filing date for the parenting assessment at this stage, and also the other assessments, and instead said that the usual 12-week time frame will be given, although this can be reviewed and extended at a later date if, for example, like Pip said, the social worker feels uncomfortable in filing a finalised report if face-to-face sessions could not have taken place. So I'm sure this is something, I haven't seen it yet, so I can't tell you what the courts will say, but it's likely that would be a reason for extending the filing date at a later date. And I can imagine that this is a stance that many judges will take in order to avoid the parenting assessment can be filed, at some date in the future. This would then at least provide a time frame to the case to enable us to reach that balance of not causing undue delay for the children, but also letting the local authority have the opportunity to undertake a fair and thorough assessment of the parents. Pip, if you could just change the slide, please. So looking at a hybrid parenting assessment, this will have to be determined on a case-by-case basis as to what proportion of the assessment sessions can be undertaken remotely, so perhaps the more general sessions, and what proportion of sessions need to be undertaken face-to-face. It may be important that it may need to be considered even that the parents do not have good quality internet access, or perhaps use of facilities which have Zoom and Skype programs on them, such as laptops. And in that case, it may be that assessment sessions do need to be face-to-face, or at least more of them will need to be face-to-face. And also, as Pip has mentioned, that there is more than usual liaison with other professionals involved with the family to establish that a full picture, as best as it can be, is obtained in order to complete the parenting assessment. I mentioned during our webinar last week that when looking at when social workers should undertake statutory visits, a balance has to be struck. And this applies equally in the scenario of parenting assessments. There must be a balancing exercise between the safety of all involved. That includes the parents themselves, the professionals, the children if they are there, and the fairness of the assessment. The local authority will need to be satisfied, as I mentioned when talking about the working example of the case, that they are confident to accept and adopt a care plan off the back of this assessment. Pip, can you just change the slide for me? Thank you. So looking at face-to-face sessions where they need to take place in order to ensure fairness. We are now at a point where groups of up to 6 can participate in a gathering outdoors, and groups of 2 or more can participate in a gathering indoors if the gathering is reasonably necessary for work purposes. And this is set out in Regulation 7 of the Health Protection Coronavirus Restrictions England Amendment number 3, Regulations 2020. So it may be that for face-to-face assessment sessions, social workers would feel more comfortable undertaking these and observing contacts between parents and children in an open space. And therefore these sessions could be taken in gardens or perhaps very quiet parks and open spaces. But this is only on the proviso that confidentiality can be maintained and the parents will be happy with the assessment session taking place this way. If indoor face-to-face parenting assessment sessions are required within the family's home, then these are permitted to take place as they are reasonably necessary for work purposes. Of course, in both scenarios, social distancing must be maintained, and as Pip mentioned, the recommended PPE should be used. It would also assist if assessment sessions are fully planned in advance so that they can take place as efficiently as possible to reduce the dangers of being in close proximity with other people. As Pip has mentioned, parenting assessments are a vital part of care proceedings. They're a vital part of the local authority's evidence, and they have a profound impact on the parents and the children and the outcome of cases. But in my view, hybrid parenting assessments promote both safety and fairness, as they minimise the face-to-face contact whilst ensuring the local authority are at least partially able to experience the behaviour of the parent and to monitor the contact between the parents and the children whilst being assessed. Also enables the local authority to undertake full and proper observations of the family unit as a whole if needs be. So that really concludes the seminar for today. I appreciate that we have run over slightly. We are happy to stay and take some questions. It may be easier if you can put the questions in the chat. Alternatively, if people need to leave, which completely understand, if you've only got 1 hour for your lunch and you'd like to have something to eat, I'm sure that questions can be submitted via email after the seminar if